Hello, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well. What we're doing today is the first in the series of lectures to get us through the course this semester, where we will be discussing life in an English monastery. Before we get into the meat of this thing, I should probably say a word or two about production values. On the first video, was down in the other end of the bunker where I exist most of the time. Actually, my location wasn't all that undisclosed. You could probably guess I'm at the basement of my house. As I may have mentioned in class, my wife and I tend to divide the house up in zones. I'm mostly in the basement. She's mostly up on the second floor, and then we share all the common areas, of course. So anyway, I'm down here, and obviously, because of the low ceiling and the fluorescent lights, I looked a little peculiar probably in the first video, but I didn't particularly mind that. I just wanted to get the thing done. My wife has a greater respect for production values, so she suggested that I actually put on a collared shirt to look a little bit more professional, if not professorial. I never look professorial. And I've moved into one of my chairs in the basement so that the lighting's a little bit better. And I don't usually lecture sitting down. This is a peculiar experience for me, but you make adjustments according to the circumstance. Anyway, I hope you guys are all doing well. Um, what I recommend that you do before you get into the lecture, in terms of listening to it in a detailed way, is go to Blackboard. I have posted there the outline for the lecture, which contains all the words and phrases that you need that are, I don't have a blackboard here, obviously, and I don't want to be flashing pieces of paper in front of you while I do this. It'll give you something to follow along with and take notes on, in fact, as you're listening to this. And as I pointed out, I'm going to do the entire topic today. It doesn't mean you need to listen to it in one sitting. You might want to break it up a little bit. Pace yourself, make it, be nice to yourself as we deal with our circumstance. And I should note, I don't know how much you're curious about other people's experiences and all this, but basically, for those of you who were in class that last day we met, the Thursday before the spring break, I think you knew that I was immediately rushing out from class and went home, went to the rental car agency, rented a car, and drove to Kentucky. And actually, is my custom. I didn't drive all the way there. The first night I got to Lexington, Kentucky, a couple hours from where my family still lives, and spent the night in a hotel. And actually, that was the very night that they had the first reported case of the coronavirus in Kentucky, which was in fact in Lexington, but nowhere near where I was at the time. So I went home, spent a number of days with my family as the thing became more and more of a serious matter in terms of the news reports. And I had the wonderful experience of being around a sister-in-law who was in complete denial about it, thought it was just a media creation, that sort of thing. And I tried to disabuse her of that notion and picked up a few things I would need on the way back while I was in Kentucky and then went home. My wife and I were both, she got back to, she went to California to visit her mother who's in a nursing home. And she returned the following Monday. I made it back the following Wednesday, and we've been here ever since, basically, as this thing has begun to spin itself out into what it's becoming. That being said, I hope you all take very seriously all the guidelines and precautions you're being given in terms how to keep the infection down to a reasonable level and not have so many people get it all at once. Many of us probably will eventually experience it at one point or another, but it's better that we follow the guidelines. You're all very young and, as far as I can tell, very healthy people. So obviously, if you happen to contract it, you would endure it much better than other people, but you want to make certain that you're not spreading it to other people, which is the big thing. So everybody needs to follow these instructions in terms of trying to reduce your exposure to it. And having made that editorial and I'll say public affairs comment, we should get down to what we're doing. So now, life in an English monastery. Up to this point in the course, we've mentioned monasticism quite a bit. It's impinged on our story indirectly when it related to other historical realities. For instance, we mentioned it when Augustine made his mission to England. He was a monk himself, and he established monasteries as well as churches in England and used them as agencies to begin the process of conversion in England. So monasticism was very important in that respect. We also mentioned the Irish monks who came over as missionaries in the northwestern part of England, and they eventually met up with the missionaries from Rome, many of whom were monks. So we mentioned monasticism in those contexts. We also mentioned that monasteries were big targets during the Viking raids, and that is going to be part of our story as we move along, the consequences of that for monasticism in England. But what we're going to do now is we're going to deal with monasticism on its own merits, not as a portion of another story, but as a story in and of itself. And what I'm going to give you here is a broader context in which you can place the specific monastic house about which I assume you're reading by now or will be reading, and which we'll be discussing as well as we can by using the discussion boards. And I should note I'll be placing up a discussion board to talk about Jocelin of Brakelond's Chronicle, and I'll give you more information about that via email. Actually, by the time you get this video, you'll probably already have the information. Now, what I'm going to give you today is a somewhat idealized conception of what monasticism was, against which you can compare the practice of monasticism in England in the late 12th and early 13th centuries as it appears in Jocelin of Brakelond. Now, this leads, of course, if you're going to talk about monasticism, you need to ask the basic why about it. Why would someone join a monastery? What was the basis of the monastic impulse, and where did it come from, and how did it spread? The most basic element behind monasticism is this thing called asceticism. What asceticism springs from fundamentally is a discomfort with the physical body. The feeling that the experiences of your senses, your sense of sight, your sense of touch, taste, smell, hearing, that they distract the individual from the individual's more spiritual element. There's a basic notion within asceticism that human nature is kind of bifurcated. We have a physical essence, we also have a more spiritual essence. And the idea here in monasticism is to try to reduce these distractions that the physical world gives to the individual. The involvement in the world itself, from the perspective of people who become involved in asceticism, is a distraction in and of itself, because if you're out in the world, you're constantly being bombarded by things that will divert your attention from your spiritual nature. And so that's where this whole impulse comes from. And it's not anything that's absolutely specific to Christianity. You see it in a lot of other traditions, religious or philosophical, where you have this notion of the importance of asceticism. And actually in the past, when I would talk about this, when there was still some memory among the student body of the core course program that preceded the freshman seminars that you took, in the core course we read a number of works that dealt directly with asceticism. The most obvious example was one of the Platonic dialogues called the Phaedo, which describes Socrates on the day of his death before he drinks the hemlock, and a discussion among Socrates and his disciples surrounding him centers around this notion of this division between the physical and the spiritual. And so it's a very much something that you find in the Greek philosophical tradition. And this also links up very well with later Christianity. They influence one another to some degree. So anyway, for an ascetic, there's a desire to mortify the body in order to emphasize the individual's spiritual nature. And this desire to do this begins to assume a form called ascesis, and that's where we get the word asceticism. What ascesis means is training, where you're training yourself to de-emphasize the physical in favor of the more spiritual. And ascesis is, in fact, a Greek word, which tells you something about the roots of this thing. I should note, however, that most of the early Christian monks were not highly educated men. They weren't reading tons of Greek philosophy or Eastern philosophy where you would see these ascetic ideas. For them, they would find their principal models for asceticism in the gospel itself. The greatest example, of course, is Christ's prayer and temptation in the wilderness before he began his ministry, where he's tempted by Satan, and he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and just basically exists out there alone. They would also find models in the lives of the disciples as they read the Gospels and also as they read the other books that eventually become the Christian New Testament. These followers of Christ were to trust to God's providence to meet all needs. It's this notion that you didn't worry about your physical survival that much or your physical needs, that God would provide for them sufficiently in some fashion. It's not something with which you should concern yourself. And there's also this obvious sense within the scriptures of a spiritual journey, that what these people begin to emphasize is a total surrender to Christ through abandonment of the world, that you push the world away. You shun it aside in order to make this connection to Christ as direct and as strong as it can possibly be from a spiritual perspective. In fact, there was a hope that if you could push the world away enough, and if you could contemplate enough, think about your spirituality, emphasize it, think about God, think about Christ, that there was a possibility perhaps for a union with God through contemplation. And that's where you begin to move into ideas of mysticism to some degree, which is very much also a part of the Christian tradition. So this is the basic impulse. And like I said, it's not something that's unique to Christianity, but it becomes eventually very much a part of Christianity and very much emphasized. Now, in terms of the appearance of monasticism, which is what we're talking about here as an institution, there are two contexts for its appearance. One context is political. It appears during the time of the later Roman Empire. And its other context is legal. What is Christianity's legal status, and what does that have to do with the appearance of monasticism? We should note, of course, as most of you already know, that initially, when Christianity appears on the scene, it is not a licit or legal religion. If we had all the time in the world, I could, in some detail, describe to you the transformation of Christianity's legal status over time. It's enough to say here that it's not a licit religion initially, and eventually it's a religion if you practice it, you could be persecuted for it by the Roman state. And in extreme instances, there are a series of persecutions under the Roman Empire, systematic ones, official ones, in which Christians are often martyred. If people are identified as Christian, and if they refuse to abjure Christianity, to move away from it, to sacrifice to the emperor, or do some act to indicate that they still followed the public or state religion on some level, or at least honored it, then they could in fact be killed by the Roman state. And this did happen at some points very aggressively. It was not a continuous thing, but it was something that certainly could happen. And many Christians, the most devoted in the Christian community, they accepted martyrdom. They didn't try to run away from it. That's where you get many of the early saints of the church. When they talk about Christian martyrs, this is the period that they in fact are talking about, the later Roman Empire. But we should note also, in terms of the legal evolution of Christianity, it does become legal eventually within the Roman Empire. This isn't on the overhead, but it's the easiest thing in the world to mention. Christianity is legalized in 312 by the Emperor Constantine, and this applies initially just to the Western Empire. By 324, it's legalized across the entire Roman Empire. And then by the close of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius, one of Constantine's successors, it's made the state religion. And what we mean by that is that it was legal to be nothing else but Christian for about the last roughly 75, 85 years of the Roman Empire. And so obviously there was a sea change. And this also means that there was a fundamental change in the environment for the most devoted of Christians. Even with the legalization of Christianity, there were still these Christians within the community who wanted to go the extra mile. Some people often use the image of Christian athleticism, not asceticism, but athleticism, that there are athletes within every community, spiritually, physically, however you want to think about it, that there are some people who are more suited to go the extra mile, who wish to go the extra mile. But there becomes a problem at this point. Once Christianity is legal, if you want to go and make the extreme act of martyrdom, you could go up to a Roman official and say, I'm a Christian, martyr me, and they would refuse to do it. And they would say, we don't do that anymore. You're actually a legal religion. And in fact, ultimately, you are the state religion, so you're not going to be martyred by the Roman state. And for these more athletic Christians, the issue then is what might they do to express that athleticism, since martyrdom was no longer an outlet available for them. It's at this juncture that you begin to hear a conception of a new type of martyrdom. They begin to describe, they draw a distinction basically between what they would call white martyrdom and red martyrdom. And you can probably sort of sort this out yourself. The red martyrdom was the old-fashioned type, where you were killed by the state for your devotion to Christianity. What white martyrdom is the new type, where you kind of martyr yourself over a long continuous period by denying yourself, by becoming an ascetic. And so a lot of people connect the impulse that begins to really fuel the appearance of monasticism with the end of the persecution of Christians by the Roman state. And so that's how it's often identified. Uh, Initially, monasticism was kind of a countercultural movement, something that was going on outside the bounds of hierarchical Christianity as it existed during this period. It was sort of on the edges, and within the more mainstream church, the hierarchical church, there was initially some discomfort with some of these practices that were engaged in. But what happens over time is this countercultural movement is brought into the church. It's made part of it. It becomes, a fundamentally significant institution within the church. And so that's a process that goes on over time as well. In terms of its appearance, there were two models for Christianity. The first model was something called Eremitic monasticism, and this was the earliest type. The Eremitic monks and nuns, these people were people who just basically cut all ties to society and went out into the desert alone. They were hermits. They're another term for them. They're often called anchorites. And so when you see these terms, they're all basically equivalent. Eremitic monk, hermit, anchorite, it all means roughly the same thing. And this is where we also begin to get the term monasticism. The Greek word monos means alone. This is someone that goes out alone. So that's the root for monasticism, monastery, monk. Eremos was the desert, which is the root for eremitic, this particular type of monasticism. The reason why it has this association is that early monasticism grew up initially in the eastern portions of the Roman Empire. It was in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, those provinces within the Roman Empire, where the movement first emerges as a Christian proposition as opposed to other religious or cultural traditions. It was initially mostly men, although women come to engage in it. These were people, some of whom we wish martyrdom, who went out into the desert and they became hermits. And some of them, actually, it's not just going out into the desert. You see a lot of what many people might consider extremist practices emerging, where you see extreme mortification of the flesh, some of the flagellation we talked about a little bit earlier on this semester. There are some high-quality examples of monks doing exceedingly extreme things. One of the most famous is this guy named Simeon Stylites. He's not on your transparencies, don't worry about him. But he was a guy who sat up on top of a pillar for several decades as his way of getting away from everything. Or you have Serapion, who bound himself in very heavy chains to help mortify his flesh, to de-emphasize the flesh and emphasize his spiritual nature. So you see these sorts of things going on in the most extreme instances, but you see these men going out into the desert, basically, as hermits. So that's the first type. And we should note, and it's actually something that's kind of current here if you think about it for a moment, it's a lot to ask somebody to cut off all human society and to go out into the desert alone. Most people aren't suited to this psychologically. It's a very difficult thing because these people were cutting off all human contact. And actually, I can probably give you actually a sort of popular cultural example of this. I don't know if any of you have seen Monty Python's Life of Brian. This comedy that the Python troupe did back in the 80s that deals with this character who was born at the same time as Christ and leads sort of an oddly parallel life. Well, at one point in the movie, Brian's being pursued by followers, and he heads out into the wilderness away from Jerusalem, and they encounter a hermit, an anchorite. I know, obviously, by that point, he's not a Christian anchorite, but he's engaging in that type of eremitic behavior where he hasn't spoken to anybody for years and has been sitting in sort of this little pit, basically, with a juniper bush as his only source of food, mortifying his flesh in an extreme way. So that's a good popular culture example of this sort of practice. But the point is, most humans are social creatures. And when people are out alone for long periods of time, given the nature of human psychology, there's a possibility of falling into despair and depression and maybe even complete psychological breakdown. It's a very exceptional person that can adopt that sort of life and keep at it in a fundamental sense. Some hermits did go kind of mad in the desert, and others committed suicide. Others, if they go out to the desert for a time and feel like they can't do it and return to the community, then they feel very badly about themselves, that they failed in some fundamental way. And as we should note, we're not functioning as hermits, or at least most of us aren't now, but we're engaging with this concept that's been labeled social isolation, where we're isolating ourselves from other people. I'm fortunate in that my wife is here, and we're not isolating ourselves from each other. But we are very much isolated from the rest of the world. And a big concern right now, and it's being expressed a lot by media and by trained professionals, is people are a little worried about the psychological impact of this distancing, what it's going to have on people in the long term, and we'll see how that goes. I should note that by apparently common opinion, I'm the one person in the University of Richmond circle that people believe will do pretty well with this. As we've been in contact with friends and other associates, mostly Joanna in contact with them over the phone and through various media, people occasionally ask how I'm doing, and with all the social distancing and stuff. And my wife's answer to them has been, well, that my husband basically invented it, so it's not much of an issue. And it's a peculiar thing, actually. Yeah, I can sit in the basement for a long time and not be particularly disturbed by not seeing people other than Joanna. And so we'll see how this goes. Maybe by the end of this, I'll be showing signs of wearing down a little bit by the time we get through all these lectures. By the end of the semester, we'll see. And that being said, I hope you're doing well. Be in touch with people whatever way you can during this. If you have Zoom, have little meals and drinks together with your friends and stuff while you're doing this. Be kind to your family and be around. I assume some of you are with your family or will be by the time you see this. But it does seem that these monks, they were inflicting on themselves something that's being inflicted on everybody right now because of our present circumstance. And you want to take care of yourself, basically, psychologically, while all this is going on. Now, having said that, since this is really hard for most people to do, was there another way of practicing monasticism that would be more in line with the typical human psyche? Well, as a matter of fact, there was. And this is where the second type of early monasticism develops. It's something called Cenobitic monasticism. And fairly easy thing to explain. Basically, this is a model that emerges to take human frailties into account. The word comes from two Greek words, koinos, bios, common life, and that describes it as well as anything. What Cenobitic monasticism is, you have it when you have the appearance of communities of monks who lived under a common rule. And so what this is people practicing asceticism and flight from the world in a community rather than doing it alone. So you have an isolated community under a set of standards by which they operate that allows them to be ascetics, to be monks or nuns, but still have a modicum, a minimum of human contact. And this becomes, obviously, at least in the Western way of doing things, Western Europe, the more common model for doing monasticism, which does bring us organically into this notion of the Western European pattern for monasticism. Monasticism gradually filtered westward. It starts out as an Eastern phenomenon, and it gradually makes its way into Western Europe. Initially in the West, you do have some eremitic monks, some people who go out away from the community, but it's the communal monasticism that becomes the dominant tradition. Part of the reason for this is that as this is filtering west, the Roman Empire in the West is beginning to fragment and fracture. And so the political instability makes going out into the desert a little dicier. Also, the climate north of the Alps made the life of a hermit a really dicey proposition. Freeze to death, die of exposure by doing it. Doing it in the desert's a different matter, where the climate's a little bit more conducive to it. But even as things filter west, there's no coherent rule for the West until you get to the 6th century. And this is where you encounter the most important person, and I can say this without qualification, in terms of monasticism as it comes to be practiced in Western Europe. It's a man named Benedict of Nursia, born around 480, lived until around 545. Initially, he was a hermit. He was a guy in Italy who went out into the wilderness. And apparently he was pretty good at it. And I should note that Italy, portions of Italy, is more conducive. You have a Mediterranean climate there. So being a hermit's a little bit better of an option as opposed to what goes on north of the Alps, or even in northern Italy for that matter. In fact, he was so good at it that people were drawn to him and he attracted disciples. He wasn't initially thrilled about this, but people were drawn to him, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit as we talk further about the development of monasticism. Anyway, he was persuaded, since he was so good at the eremitic monk thing, to found a group of men in a community. And what he attempted to do in this first shot at doing it is to impose on these guys pretty much what he imposed on himself. He was incredibly strict. You know, he set exceedingly high standards for being a monk in this community. In fact, it was so strict that he began to have kind of a mutiny, and some of the brothers tried to poison him to take him out of the way. He survived. But he learned something from this. This experience, along with his reading of a variety of the rules that were filtering in from the East, led him to forge a new type of monastic rule. He writes his own rule, ultimately. This rule, which becomes the Benedictine rule, the rule of St. Benedict, and I was actually halfway tempted to have you read it just as extra reading, but you can find it anywhere. If you're interested in it, it's a pretty quick read. I think you'd find it interesting. I'm not going to assign it, but it's sort of out there. He places this rule in force at a community at Monte Cassino, down in the greater Naples area, as you head down to Naples in Italy and in more southern Italy. This community is founded in 529. And basically, what to say about this rule? Well, the Benedictine rule provides for a fully Cenobitic community, basically. The goal of the rule is to foster obedience and humility. These are the qualities that the rule tries to inculcate into the monks and later into the nuns who adopt the rule. And another quality of the rule, and this is how it's most often characterized, it's considered to be a rule for beginners, basically. The idea is, in Benedict's mind, that you can only become a hermit by first having Cenobitic training. In other words, basically, eremitic monasticism was the most advanced type, but most people can't jump initially into that. And so first you become a communal Cenobitic monk, and you train yourself in that environment. And then if you have the wherewithal later to become an eremitic monk, that's great. But the idea here is that you start here. Moderation was the hallmark of the rule. Extremes were avoided. You don't have people on pillars and people wrapping themselves with chains and that kind of thing, or living in caves. Because Benedict believed that extremes did potentially two bad things to the monk. It could create either pride or despair. If you were really good at it, basically, in an extreme practice, you might become prideful. You'd think, well, nobody can match my ascetic mojo to a certain degree. These poor schlubs, they can't do what I do. And obviously, when you think about it, pride is problematic within Christian ideals. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. And obviously, you don't become a monk to commit sin. But Benedict understood human psychology. And so he wanted that to be avoided. And he felt extreme, that your ability to do something extreme could make you prideful. He also felt that extremes could create despair. That if you try to adopt an extreme practice and then you fail at it, from Benedict's perspective, you might feel like just a big old piece of crap at that point, and despair that you would ever be good enough to engage in monastic practice. And so he wanted to avoid both of those extremes through the rule. These monasteries, this eventually becomes basically, I wouldn't say a monastic order. We'll talk about orders later, but it becomes the principal way monasticism comes to be practiced initially in the West. It had no outside aim other than the spiritual development of the monks. It's not there to serve the world, it's there to serve the spiritual welfare of the people within the community. And Benedict used the image of a family to describe the community. The head of the community was a man named the abbot, and he was perceived as an absolute father. So he's the father of this family, which is a monastic community. In the Benedictine rule, the abbot is elected by the monks for life. They get together as a group if their abbot has died and they need to have a new abbot. And you'll see this going on in Jocelin of Brakelond, actually, in very interesting ways. They get together, they make a decision, they debate it. They usually select someone from the community, but they can often select somebody from the outside, maybe from another community, as the abbot. And once the abbot is selected, he's there for life. There's no removal of the abbot except under the most extreme circumstances. And there's no provision for this in the rule of how you would remove an abbot. It's not something that's supposed to be done. Now, once this man is elected and later abbesses within nunneries, there's supposed to be a general council of monks on any important issue. He's supposed to listen to them, to take the monks' opinions into account. And you'll discover within monastic communities, it's like any other human community. You can have disagreements, you can have personal disputes, and when these general councils are being occurred, you'll see debates going on amongst the monks about what is the best path to take in reference to whatever issue they're discussing. So he's supposed to listen to them on any matter of major importance, and he's supposed to take these opinions into account, but at the end of the day, his decision is final. He doesn't have to take their advice if he doesn't want to, if he thinks that it's poor advice. Or he can take the advice of some and not others. Ultimately, the abbot decides. And at that point, everyone is supposed to be obedient to that decision. They're not supposed to buck the abbot once the decision is made. But we should note that what's supposed to temper the abbot's decision-making is that he has to render, or the abbess has to render account for the souls of the monks, all of them, for whom they were responsible on the day of judgment. And so the monk and the abbess, they each bear a very heavy burden in this regard. And, the good ones take this very seriously. And so that's going to temper their decision-making. They'll try to make the best decision based upon all the opinions and their own knowledge and understanding. And so that's how that's supposed to work. Now, how is it that one could become one of these monks in this community? What Benedict emphasizes is slow entry, that it's not something you can just do one day and say, hey, I'm going to be a monk today, and go in and do it, or I'm going to be a nun. No, it doesn't work that way. Basically, if you went to one of these communities and they're walled, they're basically set off from the rest of the world ideally, they would keep a potential monk or nun outside for several days. They wouldn't let you in. You would knock and they wouldn't let you enter. They want to have this initial test of that. Are you serious enough to put up with being ignored for a few days before you're even allowed to have a conversation with anybody? And then once you get past that, you're not immediately made a monk or a nun. You spend a year as a novice. They would call it a novitiate, your year as a novice. And what novice means, a newcomer, a rookie, essentially, from a sports perspective. During this year as a novice, you get to be around the community. You're not a full participant. You get to observe. And during the course of that time, as you're seeing how the community functions, you're supposed to read the rule or have it read to you 3 times complete. You're going to hear everything in triplicate during that year as a novice so that you understand exactly what you're getting yourself into. And then if by that point, after that year, after having seen the community, having been on the fringes of it, participated in it maybe in a mild way, having had the rule conveyed to you 3 times, if you decide to stay, you're allowed to stay, but this is considered an absolute permanent decision. In Benedictine monasticism, its followers, once they enter, are never supposed to leave. You're supposed to be part of that community from that point forward. And it's at this point, once this permanent decision is made, that certain vows are expected to be made by the person who's entered and to become a Benedictine monk or nun. There's first of all a vow that's called stabilitas loci, stability of place. What that means is that you vow to make this your place from this point forward. You're not going to be transferring to other monasteries or other institutions. There is some movement amongst them ultimately, but you're supposed to stay there. You're not supposed to go anywhere. You're supposed to also take a vow of conversatio morum. Basically what that means is to change your behavior. That as you come in, you've lived outside of a monastery during your life prior to that time. and you've developed some habits. We all behave in certain ways. And what you have to do at this point is to alter your behavior where it fits the rhythms and requirements of the community and the rule. You're supposed to, behave like the community is supposed to behave. You're not supposed to, once you get in, do things your own way. That's something that's absolutely out of the question. So you take these two initial vows, and then once you've done this, you try to fit in. You take a specific vow of obedience to the abbot. That if the abbot says jump, well, you know how to answer that rhetorically. You know what your answer is supposed to be. How high? You're not supposed to balk. You're not supposed to hesitate. What the abbot says goes. This is when the monks do this and the nuns do this, what they're trying to do is they're striving to undo the primeval act of disobedience by being hyper obedient to the abbot, who is in turn obedient to Christ and God, basically. And so it's this notion of trying to make up for that initial sin that doomed everybody, the Adam and Eve story, the notion of primeval disobedience when they consume the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And so this is what they're trying to push back against. The other two vows, poverty and chastity, are assumed. You're supposed to be personally poor. And I should note that doesn't mean that the community can't own property. The communities do. But you as an individual are supposed to be impoverished materially. And you're supposed to be chaste. You're not supposed to have any sort of sexual relations after this point. You're supposed to be celibate. So those are absolute requirements here. So those are the basics. Those are things that you're expected to vow to do and observe when one gets in. And then what the rule also provides for is for a pattern of life, the way you'll live your life. It's going to be an exceedingly structured life once you're in a Benedictine monastic community. The day is divided into three large segments. The first segment is this thing called the Opus Dei, the work of God. This is prayer. You go to a monastery to spend a significant chunk of your time in prayer each day. That's 365 days a year. Basically, it's both private meditation, where you are on your own, praying, and it's also corporate community worship. In the case of Benedictine monasticism, the monks perform 8 services a day. And so a significant chunk of the day is spent in church, and then beyond that in private meditation. So prayer is a fundamentally big part of this. So we don't need to get into the 8 services. If you're curious about them, I can let you know what they are. But there is a very strict schedule to which these monasteries adhere. So your first part of the day is prayer. The second part of the day is spiritual reading. And this is an important assumption. Monks are assumed in the Benedictine rule to be literate. At the time the Benedictine monasticism was forged, there was still in operation some of the old Roman educational system. And so a lot of these people would have been literate coming in. Over the course of time, as these institutions wither away with the decline of the empire and sort of a knowledge implosion during the early medieval period, then it reaches a point where there have to be schools established in monasteries to make certain that the monks can read, that they have basic literacy. And this is of crucial importance in the long run. When you think about knowledge and learning, it's the monasteries that end up preserving most of it during the Middle Ages as things unravel and you move into the very turbulent early medieval period, because they can read and they can write. The spiritual reading, it's called the Lectio Divina, divine reading. At meals, when they sit, there is a monk reading to the other monks. So they're hearing something being read every time they eat. During Lent, each monk is given a book, something that's spiritually good for them, to read from cover to cover. And they produce books. You have scriptoria, basically writing offices established in monasteries to produce books. And they produce a lot of them. Scrolls. Like I said, they are crucial to this notion of preservation of certain types of knowledge, institutionally speaking. So you have the prayer, you have the spiritual reading, and then you have manual labor. The monks are expected to go out and work with their hands at something. Principally, it was intended to inculcate humility, that nobody is too good to work with their hands, and to forestall boredom, to keep people busy, because you've heard that old saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop, where you keep people busy all the time. So either they're praying, or they're reading, or they are engaging in some sort of manual activity. And a secondary benefit from this is that by working, they provide material support for their own community. And so that's how part of how these monasteries operate, through their own labor. Uh, beyond these three basic elements, manual labor, spiritual reading, prayer, you're supposed to get adequate sleep, maybe 8 hours a night. It varies according to the season and the hours of daylight and what part of Europe you're in, basically how far north and south you are. You get also a frugal but adequate vegetarian diet. You're not expected to starve yourself. You're not going to eat high on the hog. You're not going to eat meat, except under very exceptional circumstances. But you're fed adequately within this community. And so when you think about it, if we were in the room together, and this is where I really hate doing lectures this way, because I could ask you guys these crazy, stupid, rhetorical questions I do to get some of this out of you, but some should be pretty obvious to you by now. And if we were in class, I would be asking you, in terms of this regimentation, what does monasticism seem like? And you would probably then tell me, well, it kind of seems like the army, and you would be correct. This is a very regimented, quasi-military type of life. And this is something that's actually reflected in the rule to some degree. Benedict perceived the monks, these communities, as being in a type of spiritual warfare with the forces of darkness and evil. And so you have the abbot as a commander of troops in what is fundamentally a spiritual battle. And beyond this, so you have these monks in these communities trying to improve their spirituality through this regimented, quasi-military type of life. Beyond this, these monks also provided essential services for medieval society. They were the oratores of the society. They were the prayers, the people who prayed. They pray for their own spirituality and benefit. But the perception is that they pray for the entire Christian community, and everybody benefits from this in some form or fashion. This rule, once it's established, it gradually spreads from Italy through France and into England. And so this becomes really very much the pattern in Western Europe. And the reason why I spend a little bit of time here setting it up for you what Benedictine monasticism was is because Jocelin of Brakelond's the house he was in at Bury St Edmunds, that's a Benedictine house, straight line Benedictine house. And this gives you a template by which to assess what was happening at Bury St Edmunds in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Think about these basic requirements and ask yourself, to what degree are the monks adhering to this regimentation and these basic rules, and also sort of to the spirit of the rule, that there's a clear spirit in Benedictine monasticism, a sense of how there's specific written rules, but there's also some basic assumptions here about human nature and how humans should behave in a monastic community. You just ask yourself, are the monks at Bury, are they very strictly adhering to this? Are there deviations? If there are deviations, why are there deviations from it? And so it gives you a very good ideal template by which to assess what you read in Jocelin of Brakelond. And like I said, I think it's a great book. Hope you're already into it. If you haven't, get yourself into it, because you now have the material that you need to make really good sense of what's going on. This leads us, of course, to a fundamental issue that you have throughout Western monasticism. There's an inherent tension within the monastic tradition, Christian monasticism. The basic idea of monasticism is that you're trying to escape material entanglements. You're retiring from the world in order to emphasize one's spiritual essence and to make one more likely to acquire salvation, particularly in the Christian model of it. The problem here is that as individual monks become good at this, and as monastic communities become really good at this, they draw attention from the outside world. And so that by trying to flee the world, escape the world becomes intrigued, the world becomes attracted to what's going on, and the world begins to come to the monks. And so you have this fundamental problem that besets monastic life all the way throughout the monastic tradition in the West. And this is where we get into another element of what happens to monasticism over time, which is very much relevant to what goes on in Bury St Edmunds. That devoted asceticism and holiness attracts followers, and it also attracts pious donation. Now, what begins to happen as people see these monastic communities saying, well, these guys, and these women, they're really great at praying. They're very holy people, and I would like them to maybe do a little something for my benefit. And I think what they're doing is good. It's good for the entire Christian community. So then what people do, people with wherewithal, is they begin to give things to monasteries. It often comes in the form of land. It can come in the form of money. And this is where you get this sort of situation where many of these monasteries actually become, as a community, quite wealthy because they own a lot, because there's been a lot of pious donation. We should note that the wealth of the community does not keep the individual monks necessarily from being poor. So you have individual poverty as opposed to collective affluence. And they find them, over the course of monasticism's existence, they find various ways of trying to cope with this. But the larger point is that as the world comes to the monks and enriches these communities, you have reactions against the perceived corruption of the monastic ideal by these material entanglements, by the acquisition of wealth. And so what you see in Western monasticism is a cycle of reform, and then once the reforms are in place, over time, you see again decline and maybe a little bit of corruption, and then a renewal of reform. This is a characteristic throughout this tradition. And we should note that the need for reform was heightened by the realities of the Middle Ages. You had, this is beyond the scope of the course, but on the continent, you had this thing called the Carolingian Empire during the 8th and 9th centuries. It falls apart because of raids by the Vikings, and also there was aggression from the Mediterranean by the Muslims on portions of the Carolingian Empire. It falls apart, and you have these general crises in the 9th and 10th centuries where you have the Viking raids in England, and Ireland particularly is what's important. From our context, you have the Magyars coming in from Asia into the east, and you have the Muslims in the Mediterranean, and it causes things to kind of fall apart politically in the West. And you also have the looting and destruction of monasteries during this period because the monasteries were established, and in this instability, they're targets because they've acquired wealth, basically. And when houses survive, and many of them actually get wiped out, but the ones that survive, when they emerge from this period, there's often deviation from the rule, that they've lowered standards in the wake of all this instability. And you have growing secular entanglements, because when all this violence is occurring, these houses that survive, often they survive because they were able to acquire protectors, often people involved in the political military arrangements that we talked about, the knights and the lords. And these knights and lords come to perceive themselves, to a certain degree, of practically owning these institutions because they protected them. And this creates a further type of material secular influence on these monastic houses. And so, basically, in the case of England, monastic life reached a nadir, if not, even though it wasn't entirely extinguished during this period, but it reaches a very low point in the wake of the Viking raids. And as is ever the case, reform assumed a slightly different pattern in England than it did on the continent, but you see reforming movements in both places. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of the continental reforms, and then give you a sense of what went on in England, and to try to bring back monastic life. First of all, the continental pattern. There were two successive waves on the continent to reform Benedictine monasticism. And there's some separate movements within each wave, but we're just going to deal with the big two waves, basically, because they're the most important of the reform movements. The first of these reform movements appears in the 10th century. It's something known as the Cluniac reform movement. And how does this get started? Well, basically, it's a self-conscious revival of Benedictine monasticism. The feeling was by this point that monasticism on the continent, particularly in France, had declined so much because of all the instability that they needed to get back to basics again to some degree. The person that's most often associated with it is actually not a monk, but a layman. Duke William of Aquitaine, who lived from around 875 to around 918. As was the case with many nobles who'd led particularly aristocratic lives, he was concerned for his soul, and he became determined to free the church from worldly control, from temporal control or secular control, however you want to express it. He decided to found a monastery at his favorite hunting lodge in Burgundy. He was going to sponsor the creation of a house. And he granted land. This place was in Burgundy, was a place called Cluny. He granted land to Cluny, and he enshrined the principle that the monks would select their own abbot without interference from outsiders, because it had gotten to the point, by that point, where in most cases you have secular people like counts and dukes and kings selecting abbots of monasteries. He wanted to get away from that. He granted them a lot of property, and by charter they created this principle that the monks would select their own person. So they're going back to this basic Benedictine principle that the abbot is elected by the members of the house. This charter was signed in 910, and this is when Cluny begins. Now, Cluny is different in that it has a different organizational structure. You have an abbot selected at Cluny, the abbot of Cluny, who becomes a very famous person, a very famous official within Western Christendom. And over time, you have daughter houses founded by Cluny, where monks from Cluny go out and found new houses. And these are considered daughter houses. And Cluny is the mother, these other houses are the daughter. The daughters do not have abbots, they have a prior. In Benedictine monasticism, if you read the rule, the prior is the number 2 official within a Benedictine house. So basically you have one number 1, he's a Cluny. These other houses, which are daughter houses, each has a prior. The reason why I mention this is that in the earlier Benedictine rule, all Benedictine houses had been wholly independent of one another. There wasn't a hierarchy within Benedictine monasticism. With Cluny, you begin to have the creation of a hierarchy, basically. The Cluniacs were the first to create what might be termed a monastic order, where all the daughter houses answer to the mother house at Cluny. No matter how many of them are founded, they all answer to Cluny ultimately. And in terms of these monks in Cluniac houses, since they were given a lot of property to endow the houses, they didn't need to work. So they spent they didn't do manual labor, as you would see in normal Benedictine circumstances. They basically were there to pray. And what the Cluniac monks become known for, and the houses become known for, is the sophistication of Cluniac liturgy, the services they would do. They would do very beautiful, very sophisticated services, and they were doing them pretty much all the time, basically. And the Cluniacs also became known for the sumptuousness of their churches because they had such great sponsorship. And so this was the first reforming movement. And from the Cluniac perspective, the most important element of the reform was the independence, that they were independent from secular control, that these were monks that were where the abbots and priors were selected by the brothers, not by anyone else. Now, this leads us to the second Reform movement, which occurs in the 11th and 12th centuries. Basically, when you think about this period, most generally in the European medieval tradition, the 11th and 12th century was a period of basically great spiritual and religious enthusiasm. For a variety of reasons, too complicated to go into here. If we were doing a more general medieval course, I would go to it in quite detail. And there are some elements of this that will appear in the latter parts of the course when we talk about other topics. But there's this religious enthusiasm. And what happens is that the success of the Cluniacs spurred another wave of reform. And you have the creation of a second order, this thing known as the Cistercian order. The important figure here is this man named Robert of Moselm, lived from sometime around 1028 until 1111. He is in a monastic community at Moselm, and he becomes dissatisfied with his monks there. He says, things just aren't working. These guys aren't monastic enough to suit my taste and my understanding of it. And so he took part of the community and he moved them to a place called Citeaux in 1098. So basically, you're nearly close, not quite 2 centuries after the founding of the Cluniac order. This is the Citeaux is where we get Cistercian. This was the founding of the Cistercian order. Excuse me, in 1098. Robert wrote a new rule. Basically, this rule was a reaction against the perceived opulence and obsession with ornate liturgy at Cluny. He wanted to return to the unvarnished Benedictine rule. He wanted to go back to do Benedictine monasticism old school, essentially. What did this mean? It meant emphasis upon the strictest adherence to the rule possible. They're going to be super Benedictine. The monks would get a single simple garment that they would wear until it totally worn out, and only then it would be replaced. They would adhere to an ascetic diet. They would go back to this basic frugal vegetarian diet that the rule prescribes. They will be in simple, undecorated buildings, not any of the fancy Cluniac structures that went up. And they would do fewer hours of liturgy in favor of private prayer and manual labor. And so they would go back to this basic fundamentals of the original Benedictine rule. These houses were generally founded in uninhabited wasteland. They would go out into the wilderness. And part of the day would be devoted to labor in the fields or in shops. The other part of the day would be devoted to prayer. So this is what they did. Where there's a bit of a twist with the Cistercians is they would admit this other group called lay brothers or conversi. The mainline brothers, the principal brothers, they were literate monks. The conversi were guys who took monastic vows, and they joined the brothers twice a day for prayer, but they were illiterate, and they did slightly more manual, actually quite a bit more manual labor. Everybody worked, the conversi worked more. And so this was the basis for the material sort of support of the house and this movement back to Benedictine basics. And so these are the two big orders that emerge as part of this process of reforming monasticism because of monasticism's inherent tension, this notion that being good at monasticism brings the outside world to the monks and to their institutions. Now, so that's what happened on the continent. What happens in terms of reform and renewal in England was a little bit different. Basically, in the case of England, you almost, in the wake of the Viking era, have a refounding of monasticism because monasticism took a heavy hit in England as a result of this. The historian and spiritual writer Asser, he's an Englishman, claimed that monasticism utterly vanished in England as a result of the Viking incursions. And this is probably an exaggeration, but it's doubtless that monasticism was at a very low ebb in the wake of the Viking raids. And so in terms of reestablishing it, the person, in terms of a king who's significant, is Edgar the Peaceable. He is one of the descendants of Alfred the Great. And we talked about Edgar already in another context early in the semester. He ruled from around 959 until 975. He was one of the first kings who could actually be called a king of England because he's ruling as the reconquest of the Danelaw has more or less been completed. And what he wants to do, since he's reconquered everything and things are becoming stabilized, is he wants to reestablish monasticism in England on a better basis. And in terms of the work that was actually done, it was done by three spiritual figures, three monks who revived monasticism. Dunstan, Oswald, and Ethelwald. They are each given quite a bit of credit for monastic revival in England. Ethelwald, around 970, wrote this thing called the Regularis Concordia. And it was a document forged by him with the express intent of giving governing principles for a revived English monasticism. Basically, this was Benedictine monasticism with some slight influences coming from contact with the continent, but basically it's the Benedictine pattern that they try to go back to here when they reestablish monasticism in England. And this remained the pattern throughout to the end of the Anglo-Saxon era up to the time of the Norman conquest. To give you kind of a scorecard here so that we can understand this, in 1066, the year of the conquest, when William the Bastard comes over, there were 48 Benedictine houses in England. 36 of them were men's houses. 12 of them were nuns. And so you have 48, a nice 4 dozen, 3 dozen of them men, a dozen of them women. And so that was sort of the state of things. And I should note that one of these houses was the house at Bury St Edmunds. And it was one of the main ones, actually, that was there prior to the conquest. And then William conquers. And we see the Norman conquest, as it is in so many respects, a watershed for monasticism. During the Norman period, the Anglo-Normans rule up until Henry II takes over and starts the Angevin dynasty in 1154. We can give you a scorecard here as well. So take 1154 as your year. That's when the Anglo-Norman period ends. By that time, there were 245 houses in England. In other words, monasticism had increased fivefold over the course of a century. 173 of them were men, 72 of them were women. And there were a number of orders there. They were mostly Benedictine, but there's also some other orders that were established in England in the interim. A couple of quick things about this Norman expansion of monasticism. It is a shift from Anglo-Saxon to Norman in the sense that, as with the secular Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, the Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical aristocracy was also replaced over time. Basically, a handful of abbots of questionable political leanings or of irregular life were removed by the Normans early on. They were just pushed out and replaced. The rest of it was done by a process of attrition. As the old Anglo-Saxon abbots would die off, they would be replaced either with Frenchmen or by Normans, basically. By the close of William the Conqueror's reign, the vast majority of these abbots, these Anglo-Saxon abbots, had been replaced. And so you're moving into a more Norman French rule of these houses. And we should note that it's also, as this time is going on, that you have the imposition of military obligations on these monasteries. We talked about this a little bit, that the major monastic houses, and even some of the smaller ones, they owe knights to the king. And so they have to take some of their lands and turn them into knights' fiefs so that these knights can support themselves. So they become very much tied into the political and military arrangements in England. And this comes out in the clearest way possible when you read Jocelin of Brakelond, because it's something that each abbot in each community had to deal with, for good or for ill. We should also note the Normans founded new abbeys. And the best example here is that, you had the Battle of Hastings. And as you should already know, after the battle, there was a monastery, Battle Abbey, that was founded there to commemorate William's victory at Hastings. And that abbey still exists. Actually, it's not. It exists as a structure. You have the dissolution of the monasteries in England, so there's been nothing continuous there. And during the Reformation, all the monasteries are dissolved. But as a physical structure, you can go visit it. And I should note that the big conference for Anglo-Norman studies, the Battle Conference, is held most years at Hastings near Battle Abbey. I attended it actually. I've attended it a couple times over the years. I'm not an Anglo-Norman person. My interests are later, but there have been reasons for me to be there in the past, and actually it's kind of neat to go visit there, and you go get to visit the battlefield at Hastings, and have people who really understand that sort of stuff explain it to you, which is really great. We should note, beyond these new foundations, Cluniac influence was very limited in England. It didn't really catch fire there. There were some houses, English houses, that were influenced by Cluniac principles, but there was no directly dependent house on Cluny until 1077, so it didn't become that big a deal there. Cluniac houses remain limited in number. You don't have lots of those in England. These houses, moreover, had only a very loose tie with the mother house at Cluny until well into the 13th century, so there's not a major influence there. But the Cistercian influence was expansive in England. It was very important. There were many of the new foundations in the 12th century were, in fact, Cistercian houses. It was particularly attractive in areas with underdeveloped wastes. And the best example here is that, William the Conqueror did that nasty thing in the north where he harried the north and tore up Jack in Yorkshire. And we talked about that a little bit. In the wake of his destruction there, you have a lot of wasteland, and all these areas appear in Domesday Book described as waste. You have a bunch of Cluniac houses founded in Yorkshire in the north, such as Fountains Abbey, Byron Abbey, St. Mary's of York. There's a long list of them. And they're interesting to visit because, as is the case with most monasteries in England, because of the dissolution in the 16th century, many of these abbeys are sort of beautifully ruined. And this is where I wish I was in class with you. I was going to show you some slides of all this stuff, some images. Maybe I'll put some up online for you so you can take a look. I actually tried to put up some images for Bury St Edmunds because I have a lot of Bury St Edmunds images because I have a personal interest in the house, which I'll probably explain to you a bit later. Anyway, you have all these influences coming in this revival of monasticism, which brings us to Bury St Edmunds, this particular house I've chosen to have you emphasize a bit. It's a Benedictine house which had been founded prior to the Norman conquest. It was, as I've already noted, one of the half dozen largest and richest of England's ancient Benedictine houses. It was neither Cluniac nor Cistercian. It is Benedictine, and that's why it's a good one to compare with the rule. Read the rule, understand the rule, then compare what's going on at Bury St Edmunds. It's also an excellent example of how a large house functioned in reality. You get to see the actual nuts and bolts of the workings of a monastic house when you read Jocelin of Brakelond. It's also an excellent example of the relationship between a traditional English house and the rest of society. How does Bury deal with the world? Well, you'll get to see it in this chronicle. And it also had this very excellent chronicler for the late 12th and early 13th century, this guy named Jocelin of Brakelond, who was one of the monks within the community. So he's not writing as an outsider. He's writing as somebody who actually lived in the house at a very important time when it was under the rule of its most famous abbot, this guy named Abbot Samson, who is one of the most famous abbots of all time, actually, from a certain perspective. He writes this chronicle about Abbott's reign called the Chronicle of the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds. So keep, as you read Jocelin, or maybe as you reread parts of it, keep the fundamental principles of Benedictine nurse's rule in mind, and ask yourself continuously, how Benedictine or something other than Benedictine is this? And having said that, I'm going to sign off now. This is all we have to say about it. And I got done actually in 1 hour and 5 minutes, which is a lot, but it's not, I hope, unbearable. So once again, I want to emphasize, take care of yourselves. I'll be in touch about the next installment where we'll talk about the Celtic fringe and try to give you some background material to show you where William Wallace and Braveheart fits in the meantime, take care of yourselves. Stay in touch. Bye-bye until later. Take care.